In the previous video on Olympiodorus' commentary on the first Alcibiades, I promised to delve a little bit deeper into the nature of a Platonic dialogue. But before we can clarify this, we need to understand what dialogue is. Of course, in its most obvious understanding, a dialogue is a conversation, which can occur either orally or in written form, and typically occurs between two or more persons. When a dialogue is occurring live, it is characterized by spontaneity and unpredictability. It doesn't have pretty flourishes or poetic touches, and oftentimes it is unrefined and unedited, and can occur in quick, rapid bursts of communication. According to Dmitry Nikulin, there are four main components that turn a conversation into a dialogue. The first is the personal other. There is always the presence of a personal other, for a conversation is always a dialogue with the other, even if that person is absent from the room. There's also a second personal other, who is the other of oneself. This second personal other is always present in any conversation, and no matter how much you might try to express this personal other, it is in the final analysis inexpressible. There are ways in which we dialogue with ourselves continually, but to whom is our inner conversation being addressed? Of course, to our personal other. 2. Voice. To engage in dialogue with the other, what is required is, quote, a minimum of corporeality, which can be understood as the, quote, minimally embodied voice, which represents the borderline between the physical and the mental, and belongs ultimately to both. A voice must resonate with another voice. As Nikulin states, quote, therefore the voice is a voice for the other and with the other. Each voice exists independently and uniquely, and both voices cannot speak simultaneously, since that does not really constitute a dialogue. When one voice speaks, even though the other is silent in anticipation or reflection, that silent voice is still present in its absence, within the confines of the dialogue. 3. Unfinalizability. A dialogue is not simply an exchange of information, but a meeting between two utterly unique and inexhaustible individuals who can never be fully labeled and explained away. This means that it is impossible to exhaust one's relations with the other, including one's own relations with the personal self. 4. Allocensis. Dialogue is characterized by what is known as allocensis, which can be considered the opposite of consensus. What consensus does is to effectively neutralize and end the dialogue, and in the words of Nikulin, quote, ignores the insurmountable conflict of personal exchange. Allocensis retains a level of disagreement, which is the natural condition of two unique individuals coming together, which means that no two people will agree on absolutely everything. There's always difference. And even though it is marked by disagreement, allocensis is not entirely negative, for it can also be productive, since it, quote, allows one to recognize the difference of and from the other through a dialogical and unfinalizable unwrapping of the inexhaustible contents of one's personal other. Since metaphysically we can understand that existence precedes essence, the most primordial and irreducible element of a human being, as well as a god, is the fact of their being an individual. This individuality precedes any attributes or powers that can be ascribed to a god. One of the main differences between our individuality and a god's individuality is the fact that ours is by nature limited, whereas the god's individuality is an unlimited continuum, meaning that each god is infinite, because each god is all gods. Every time an individual engages in a new dialogue, it is always renewable, since each person is granted the freedom to continue to participate and to self-disclose. Furthermore, any dialogue is ultimately de-centered, since every participant in the dialogue can, at any point in the conversation, become its center. In this sense, it is polycentric. And this polycentricity of dialogue among a number of interlocutors is a mirror of the polycentric manifold that the gods established through their relations and interactions in the Olympian realm. The god as an individual is irreducible, just as a human being is. Even though Plato had observed the dialogues in written form, the proper way to engage with the text is for it to be read aloud with other people. By having it read aloud in the presence of others, there's a possibility that alternative interpretations can be revealed and articulated. This speaks to the inherent openness of the text to various hermeneutics. To speak of a rigid Platonic dogma is to misunderstand the living nature of the text and its disclosure through the interpretation and reinterpretation of its content. In this sense, we are literally viewing the text as a dynamic, living entity, and we'll expand on this notion later on in this video. Another reason for reading the text aloud in the presence of others is due to the magical power of the voice. As we just observed with Nikulin, the voice is the minimum of embodiment and corporeality, bordering between the physical and the mental in terms of its presence. But the voice also is alluring and seductive because it speaks to its own erotic powers. Powers of eros that carry the listener and the speaker in an anagogic ascent that elevates the soul. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus has himself tied to the mast of his ship so that he can hear the alluring and enchanting song of the Sirens. In this respect, he can be seen as the attentive voice, the inactive one, that preserves its presence in a dialogue, even though it is not speaking. Calypso forewarns him of the Sirens' voice. Quote, "Whoso in ignorance draws near to them and hears the Siren's voice, he never more returns." It would appear that Odysseus is drawn first and foremost to the voice of the Sirens and its melodic beauty. Quote, "First she bade us avoid the voice of the wondrous Sirens in their flowery meadow. Me alone she bade to listen to their voice." By listening to their voice, which is intermingled with their song and absolutely inseparable from it, Odysseus is being enchanted both by the song and the voice of the Sirens, just as much as the content of their knowledge that they possess. They summarize their knowledge in the following lines. Deur agion poluaen Odysseus, megakudos akaiun nia katasteson hina noeterin opacusis. Ugar potis tide parilase nie malaini, prin gehemeon meligerun apostomaton opacusai. Al hoge terpsamenos netai kai pleon aidos, idmen gartoi panth, hos eni Troi iurie. Argeoi Troes teteon iotite mogesan, idmende hossa genetai epikthoni pulu boterie. Come hither, as thou farest, renowned Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans. Stay thy ship, that thou mayest listen to the voice of us two. For never yet has any man rowed past this isle in his black ship until he has heard the sweet voice from our lips. Nay, he has joy of it, and goes his way a wiser man. For we know all the toils that in wide Troy the Argives and Trojans endured through the will of the gods, and we know all things that come to pass upon the fruitful earth. In the Hellenistic and Roman eras, we begin to see a shift in the image of the Sirens as harlots and prostitutes, equivalent in a sense to musicians and performers who seduce through enchantment, that leads some to view them with suspicion. This seductive quality of the Siren becomes subsumed to the element of knowledge that they impart, so that first Apollonius of Rhodes in his Argonautica can have Orpheus drown out the songs of the Sirens with the sound of his lyre, through an aggressive and violent overpowering of them, literally in Apollonius's wording, ebiesato, does violence to them. Once again, as Nikulin remarks, a dialogue cannot be had when two people talk over each other, each seeking to overpower the other. This is not dialogue, but rape. Later on, we will find Cicero performing a further sanitization of the power and musicality of the voice, where he almost exclusively promotes the sirens to purveyors of knowledge and wisdom. Cicero's insistence on Homer's favoring the knowledge over the pleasure of listening to the voice is an intellectualizing strategy that favors the written text over its vocalization. Rather than preserving both pleasure and knowledge, as in Homer, we are seeing the sirens divorced from their sensuous aspect. The progression of philosophy will see a further intellectualization of knowledge and the intellect, especially as writing increasingly becomes a medium for communication and knowledge transfer. In my opinion, it is precisely this Homeric conception of the bi-unity between pleasure and knowledge that Socrates and Plato are preserving in their dialogue form. The fundamental difference between dialogue and dialectic is that the former involves engagement with the other, whereas the latter can be used as a tool autonomously, without engagement with this irreducible other. Plato understood that the art of dialectic emerges from dialogue, and saw dialectic as the way, which, of course, mind you, consists of a number of different tools and methods, to show and demonstrate through reason what the nous already knows without having to rely on language itself. For Plato, dialectic allows for an upward movement toward being through the revelation of the forms in the intellect or in the reason. But this art of dialectic emerges from dialogue and operates alongside it, rather than taking sole possession of the inquiry. Although truth claims can be achieved through live oral dialogue, it is not inherently dialectical. What a live dialogue allows for is the expression of oneself, of one's personal other, in the presence of the other person as witness, and has a tendency for spontaneity and unexpected insights. But the Socratic dialogue, as many have observed, often comes to no finalizable or definitive conclusion, and in order to transcend this limitation of dialogue, the royal art of dialectic emerges as an antidote. The history of modernity can be seen as a gradual movement away from the spontaneity of the dialogical toward the monological. For example, the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages began to fully separate dialectic from dialogue, and made dialectic entirely logical and self-critical of reason itself. The culmination of this philosophical trend will later be seen in the work of 19th century philosopher Hegel, who transformed dialectic into a universal tool while making philosophy a self-contained system of logic. In an illuminating chapter in the book entitled Forests, The Shadow of Civilization by Robert Pogue Harrison, we are given a perfect example of how this modern monological and monoconscious subject emerges in history, and how this becomes the root of our modern crisis. One can see this in Descartes' work entitled Discourse on Method. In his writings, Descartes discovers the method of res cogitans, closely related to his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," and essentially entails the separation of the thinking mind or consciousness from the physical world. Harrison describes Descartes' book, which was written in pursuit of stable foundations for knowledge, and Descartes' horror of falsehoods and unreliable opinions or beliefs, also known as doxa. Descartes sees himself as a traveler who has found himself lost in the forest. This has echoes in the famous opening line of Dante's Commedia, where he had also found himself in a dark forest. Quote, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost." For Descartes, the forest represents this darkness of falsehoods, opinions, and beliefs, all devoid of knowledge. The forest is also symbolic of tradition and inherited wisdom, things that were perhaps speculative, spontaneous, inexhaustible in their richness of flourishing and vitality. In essence, the forest as nature herself. However, none of this is in line with his Cartesian rationalism. He only trusts in the method, which in Greek is comprised of meta and hodos, meaning following after or going or moving along with a way, a route or way to escape the confines and confusion of the forest. In Descartes' own words, quote, "In this I would imitate travelers who, finding themselves lost in a forest, ought not to wander this way and that, or what is worse, remain in one place, but ought always walk as straight a line as they can in one direction and not change course for feeble reasons, even if at the outset it was perhaps only chance that made them choose it. For by this means, if they are not going where they wish, they will finally arrive at least somewhere where they probably will be better off than in the middle of a forest." Harrison observes that whereas Dante, quote, "depended on divine assistance to get out of the forest, it came to him in the figure of Virgil, but once it finds its foundation in the res cogitans, Descartes' subject of knowledge can rely strictly upon its own resources to escape the realm of randomness and error, thanks to its adherence to the linear path of mathematical analysis." As we can see here, the modern monological subject excludes the other in all their spontaneity, and by excluding the other, this also implies the other of the natural world, or the living cosmos. Harrison remarks, quote, "The knowledge that Cartesian rationalism seeks by way of method is not merely of the speculative sort, as in the traditional schools. It has an active and practical ambition. It is not knowledge for knowledge's sake, any more than the craftsman's technical know-how is. The ways of method promise neither salvation nor wisdom, but rather power. They lead to the mastery and possession of nature, that is to say, toward an appropriation of the power traditionally assigned to God. Reason, method, and technical craftsmanship come together at the end of the discourse in a secular confession of the will to power." Here is Descartes explaining himself in his own words. Quote, "These general notions show me that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that is very useful in life, and that in place of the speculative philosophy taught in the schools, one can find a practical one, by which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, just as we understand the various skills of our craftsmen, we could, in the same way, use these objects for the purposes for which they are appropriate, and thus make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature." Contrary to this, Socrates in the Phaedrus demonstrates how a dialogue entails the most radical freedom a human being can experience. Nicoulin notes that in this particular dialogue, Socrates speaks under the guise of different voices. By doing this, he is effectively distancing himself from himself in an act of purification, vomiting forth and emptying out his subjective self so that it can allow for a space for others to speak through his body using their own voices, while preventing distortion in the transmission. By doing so, Socrates is relaying what is heard, and in this sense is enacting the role of the Delphic priestess who empties herself out and thereby creates space for the god to possess her and have the oracle emerge through her as through a medium. Similarly, by relaying what is heard, Socrates is honoring the power of the voice indirectly. This sense of recounting a complex web of narrators who've one by one passed on what they've heard to the present moment of the dialogue occurs a number of times throughout Plato's dialogues. For example, in the Parmenides, in the Timaeus, and most famous being the recounting of the myth of Atlantis. So sticking to our previous discussion, but stripping the force analogy of its negative connotations, how does one in fact use method in the forest without causing violence to nature herself? This is where the Neoplatonists come in, with the notion of analogy, analogia. According to the Neoplatonists, analogy establishes the relations between the superficial or apparent meaning of the text of the Platonic dialogue, the literal reading of it, with the transcendental realm. Through this move, we can see the emergence of a new form of literary criticism. But with the Neoplatonists, with their religious devotion and piety, this is more than simply literature as we understand it today. The Neoplatonists, at least post-Iamblichian Neoplatonists, saw the intimate connection between Plato's written works and living organic organisms. In essence, each dialogue is a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. Because Plato was divinely inspired, he was able, like a mini demiurge, to construct or fashion an artful text that reproduced a manifestation of the realm of forms that he would have looked to as his paradigm. In this sense, by mirroring the forms, each dialogue is a self-contained cosmos whereby the whole and the parts are engaged in mutual, interconnected relationships. And just as the cosmos is renewed through an eternal series of processions, the dialogue hints at these powers and levels of ontology within the text itself. This comparison of the dialogue with a cosmos is explicitly stated in the anonymous prolegomena to Platonic philosophy. Quote, "As we have seen, then, that the dialogue is a cosmos and the cosmos a dialogue, we may expect to find all the components of the universe in the dialogue. The constituents of the universe are these: matter, form, nature, which unites form with matter, soul, intellect, and divinity. In the dialogue we have, corresponding to matter, the characters, the time, and the place in which Plato represents his dialogue as happening." For example, in Proclus's commentary on Plato's Parmenides, the first few sections outline a complicated series of 4 conversations between various individuals who each set the scene for the actual philosophical discussion between Parmenides, Zeno, and Socrates. Without going too much into the detailed hermeneutics of the text, Proclus identifies each of these conversations with a different level of ontology, so that according to the scholar Dillon, quote, "The last is the lowest, representing the informing of sense objects. The indefiniteness of Cephalus's audience represents the formlessness of the receptacle. The previous conversation, that of Antiphon to the philosophers of Clazomenae, represents the entry of forms into the physicae usiae, by which is meant the genera and species, which receive form prior to the information of sensible particulars. The second conversation, that of Pythodorus to Antiphon and his friends, continuing up the scale of being, represents the progression of forms into souls. The final conversation represents the structure of nous itself, with Parmenides, Zeno, and Socrates all-encompassing motions of the nous. When the dialogue is a cosmos and the cosmos is a dialogue, then every single name, place, sentence structure, or narrative sequence is fundamental to the interpretation of the text. Because we are not just reading a simple conversation that is recorded in writing, but a transcript of the universe itself. As J.A. Coulter states in his work, The Literary Microcosm, rather than being some later Neoplatonic projection onto the text of Plato, there is evidence that Plato himself also hinted at the possibility that a philosopher-poet or even a rhetorician could create a representation which directly imaged the intelligible realms, and not as mere copies of the world. The anonymous prolegomena also confirms this notion. Quote, "For in the same way that a dialogue has different personages, each speaking in character, so does the universe comprise existences of various natures, expressing themselves in various ways, for the utterance of each is according to its nature." In addition, Neoplatonic commentators identify the introduction to the texts as guidelines on how to read them. These guidelines assist the reader in orientating the text to ensure the unity of Plato's intent, so that we do not simply devolve into a cacophony of disparate doctrines, while still also maintaining their overall holistic union throughout the multiplicity of topics. Hermaeus says, quote, "All these, then, have lit upon certain parts of the dialogue, and declared the subject of the whole dialogue on the basis of these. But in fact there should be one subject equally relevant to all parts, so that, as in the case of a living organism, all should be related to this one principle. It is for this reason that Iamblichus declared the subject to be, quote, the beautiful on every level, as we shall expound below." Or in another quote, "So then one must not declare that there are many subjects of the dialogue, for everything in the dialogue must relate to some one end, that the dialogue may be, so to speak, one living being. Nor should one fix the subject of the whole dialogue on the basis of a part, but one must identify one subject matter to embrace the dialogue as a whole, and this is, in a word, the beautiful on every level. Therefore, the scopos, translated as the target or aim of the dialogue, is likened by the author of the anonymous Prolegomena as the metaphysical one, manifesting on the literary level. This, however, does not mean that each text is forever frozen into one or a definite series of interpretations, for those are not definitely determined. The divinity or the Godhead approximates the good of the Platonic dialogues. The good being the end or the reason for why the dialogue was written in the first place. In this sense, then, in a polytheistic understanding, since each God is the good, many readings and interpretations of the text can be performed, depending on the nature of the reader's soul, their intentions, and the particular God they are evoking or following or participating in. The gods are of course present, even here, as Proclus states, quote, "But these things, as I said, bear the likeness, icon, of gods themselves, and make it very easy for those who wish to follow the analogy." Interestingly, the notion of the scopos appears in a different guise in the works of Homer. Although the definition of the term has changed in its linguistic meaning, the older Homeric usage is also quite fitting for the Platonic project. In Book 23 of the Iliad, during the funeral games of Patroclus, Achilles designates his childhood tutor Phoenix to place himself in the position of a scopos, or a special observer, of the chariot race that is about to begin. Quote, "So that he remember the course and bring back a true account. Hos memneota dromus kai alethein apoepoi." According to E.J. Backer, quote, "Remembering in Homer also involves perception as a special attentive act of cognition. Phoenix's memory of the race is not the recall of a fact or experience from the past, but an attentive perception from a privileged vantage point, and the truth, alethein, of his act as referee is not an objective relation between his account and reality, but a special state of mind, both in seeing and in speaking. Phoenix's mind is supposed to be free of lete, or forgetfulness." As we can see, the scopos that the Neoplatonists associate with the one and its unifying aspect, making a dialogue an irreducible unit while preserving it as a cosmos, is in Homer presented as a privileged observer with a godlike state of mind who takes an account of reality that recalls and remembers, an essential enterprise illustrative of the Platonic project as a whole. According to Callian, there are three suppositions that ground the Neoplatonic interpretation of a dialogue. 1. Nothing in Plato's corpus is unintended or there by chance. 2. Plato's writings are divinely inspired. 3. The principle of panta and passin, which means that everything is in everything. The final point also grounds the practice of theurgy, which Proclus takes to be the highest art, even superseding wisdom. For it is the same principles that link the structure of the dialogues with the cosmos at large that actually make theurgy even possible. For example, the material constituents of the cosmos itself also partake in divinity, and therefore a statue is not some abstraction of a deity, but is in fact an instantiation of the deity's corporeal presence due to its replication of the god's image. This is the metaphysical justification for correspondences. Western civilization has taken the path of Descartes and Hegel with their singular monological method, and have effectively alienated both themselves and us from the cosmos itself. If the entire world is a theophany, then everything in it is a manifestation of the gods and their divine activity. And this too includes the divinely inspired texts and dialogues that resonate with those powers that comprise the cosmos itself. For it is only through reading, studying, and interpreting such texts that the soul can elevate itself in the process of anagoge. Even though the act of allegorical interpretation is difficult, Proclus says, quote, "For it is a good exercise for a well-endowed soul, which is capable of moving from images to their archetypes, and delights in observing these all-pervading analogies." So let us never forget that the movement of knowledge from images to archetypes through analogy is a delight for souls. just as the Sirens promised. Quote, "Stop your ship and listen to our voices. No one ever sailed past in his black ship without first hearing the honey-sounding voice from our lips. He delights in it and goes on his way, richer in knowledge." And let us never forget that the danger of the Sirens lies precisely in the price one must pay for this knowledge of the world beyond, and the pathway to return to our divine origins. And for the Platonic philosopher, that price is both death and salvation. Take care for now.